Okay, good morning, everyone in the Americas, and good afternoon, evening in other parts of the world. Again, thanks all for being here for another fine session. My name is Lauren Hayes. I'm the host of today's seminar. And I'm really glad that everyone's here. You know, some of the folks were talking while we were setting up about how, you know, one of the silver linings of this struggle we're all going through is that FINE has brought us all together, and it's been a lot of fun getting to see people and hearing great talks, and I'm really excited about today's speaker. Before I introduce her, I want to just again thank the last week's speaker, Mata Mansur, for a really interesting and fascinating talk on vocal diversity in mongooses. Next week will be the last seminar of the fall FINE seminar series. Romain Libric will be from the University of Mons. We'll be talking about the evolution of youth sociality in ants. We'll also update everyone on the spring FINE seminar series. We have a full slate scheduled and are making final arrangements for that. So we're excited to start that up again in March. Just about today's FINE structure for the folks who are newly joining us. The seminar will take about 45 minutes to an hour, and afterwards we'll have a discussion during which I ask you to post your questions in the chat with a question mark, and I'll call on you. We're also having someone tracking YouTube, so if folks on YouTube have questions, please put those in the chat there and someone will relay them to me. As I asked, please make sure that during the seminar your microphones are on mute. That way it will stay engaged on the speaker at all times. So this brings me to today's speaker. I'm really happy to present to you Leticia Aviles. And Dr. Aviles comes to us from the University of British Columbia in Canada. She's in the Department of Zoology and also affiliated with the Biodiversity Research Institute. She earned her undergraduate degree in Ecuador, where she's originally from, and then earned a PhD at Harvard University, after which she did a postdoc at the University of Arizona and was a professor there before moving on to the University of British Columbia, where she's been for about 15 years. I've been really, you know, I went and looked at her webpage and everything, and I found her really fascinating. And I was actually, I won't read the quote, but I was taken by a quote on a blog that she had where she talked about how, you know, what we do is a calling, and that our calling as behavioral ecologists is to uncover the beauty that lies in the organisms we study. And that was the sentiment of the comment. And I found that really moving, a really powerful comment about how we all are listening to the animals that we're studying and learning from them. Her research along those lines is focused on empirical and theoretical approaches using social spiders as her study organism. She has her recent work has been looking at how the environment shapes the organisms, these social spiders, and I think she'll be talking to us about some of that work today. Her work takes her to various parts of the world where she studied these social spiders, including in the tropics. She also spoke to me about doing some work in North America as well. She has an impressive publication record. I was going through the publications, and one thing that jumped out at me is that, you know, American Naturalist, she's done a remarkable job publishing there, which is impressive. I would dream to publish a paper there, and it was quite an honor to be reading her publication list. So she published in journals like American Naturalist, Proceedings, Behavioral Ecology, and then also what's nice is she has some publications scattered into the more taxonomic journals, which I really value. Has a strong record of training postdocs, graduate students, lots of undergrads in the lab, which is really great. And she's got numerous awards. So for example, she's a fellow of the Animal Behavior Society and the Institute of Advanced Studies in Berlin. And so with that, her title of her talk today is The Ecology of Spider Sociality. And with that, Leticia, please take over. I'm looking forward to hearing your talk today.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was a wonderful introduction. And thank you, Karsten and Eduardo, for having had the idea of organizing this series. It has been really amazing, inspiring, and I'm very honored to be able to share with you some of the work that myself and my students have been doing on social spiders. And so let's see, let me start sharing my screen here. So can everybody see the screen with the title slide? Perfect, thank you. Okay, so I will be talking about work that I have done ever since I was an undergraduate, actually, on spider sociality. And there have been several topics that I have dealt with, but today I will be focusing on the question of why they are social. And then I expanded a little bit into how being social changes the role they play in ecological communities. So let's see. So one of the reasons we study social systems is because they help us understand the origins of higher levels of organization. So in the history of life, we have lower level units associating into higher levels of organization. So this happens in the origin of multicellular organisms, but also in the evolution of animal societies. And so when we think about these associations, we ask, why do these associations form? What factors explain their diverse systems? And once they form, how does their ecological niche change? And so these are the topics that I'm going to be covering using social spiders as a model system. And social spiders have been my organisms ever since I was an undergraduate in Ecuador. And here's just a sample of some of the species I have worked with. And they are very diverse, as you can see. They look very different. They belong to different spider families. Actually, and I was fortunate that some of these species I discovered as I was doing my either undergraduate or graduate work in the tropics. So these 4 species here are a sample of the neotropical social spiders I have worked with. And so people know most spiders are solitary. And here's just a picture of a solitary species in a genus that contains social species. And this is a species that builds this sort of irregular web. And that sort of irregular and most of the time 3-dimensional web is going to be key to the story that I'm going to be telling as to why they are social. So even in general, where you have the social species, they are solitary species where the offspring will eclose from the egg sac, but then they will disperse soon thereafter. But in some species, instead of dispersing, the offspring stay together for a while. They stay together with the mother. And during the period when they live together, they help each other maintaining the communal nest. They cooperate in prey capture, they share their food. So, but in these species that we refer to as subsocial, the offspring disperse before they reach reproductive maturity. So the nests contain just a few dozen individuals, and typically the offspring of a single female. But there are some species where instead of dispersing, the offspring mature within the natal nest, and they mate with each other and produce an offspring generation that continues to expand the nest. And this can happen depending on the species until these colonies grow to contain a few hundred, and also depends on the location where they are. So some colonies may contain hundreds of individuals in some species, and in other species, they may grow to contain even thousands and tens of thousands of spiders. So here's a web that I photographed in the rainforest in Ecuador that covers a couple of crown of trees, and I calculated contain between 10 and 20,000 spiders. So these are all species, in this case, in the genus Anelosimos, where we see that there is a range of social systems from solitary, subsocial, and social. And this is the genus that I have done most of my work with, and it is the genus that I will be focusing my talk on today. But before that, I'd like to sort of give you an overview of what social spiders are in general. And I think one of the things that makes the social spiders especially exciting is the ways in which they are different from other social organisms. So unlike the eusocial insects, they lack reproductive castes. So individuals within the colonies are all capable of reproducing. They do compete with each other for reproduction, but a large fraction of individuals within colonies reproduces. So here we have a photograph of one of the social spiders where we see adult females carrying egg sacs. And so they have communal brood care within the colonies. And so multiple females reproduce within colonies. And the other thing, so this makes them different from eusocial insects, but the other feature that makes social spiders different from the vast majority of social organisms is that males and females remain within the natal nest to mate. And this happens generation after generation. As a result of that, they are highly inbred. And we can see the consequences of these to the genetics of the spiders. Here's data from my colleague, Deborah Smith of University of Kansas, where she used genetic markers to look at the alleles that characterize individuals within colonies. And we see here that the spiders here within this colony, they are identical to each other. They do reproduce sexually, but they are so inbred that they are within colonies essentially fixed to the same genotype. But then colonies that are near each other may be fixed to different alleles. So the colonies basically are these isolated lineages that grow, proliferate, and become extinct with no mixing to one another. So in this figure, we have what you can envision here, time going towards the right. And we have a colony that is growing. At some point, it reaches a relatively large size. It produces daughter colonies. Some of those, or most of those, will go extinct, but some of the lineages will continue over time. So there is inbreeding, population subdivision, there is dispersal, and there is extinction. One of the consequences of this population structure and dynamics has been the evolution of highly female biased sex ratios. Here we see data collected by myself and colleagues over the years, and showing that the proportion of males produced in the colonies, and these are primary sex ratios estimated by looking at the chromosome number of developing embryos, the sex ratios range between 10 to 30% males within colonies. The other thing that makes the social spiders really interesting is the fact that the colonies are deems and they are populations, and they can be used to study processes of population growth and population dynamics, extinction and dispersal. The webs, the nests of the spiders remain fixed in place so that you can come every week, every month, every year, and you can sort of follow their growth. So over generations, here's a small nest that probably contains possibly just the clutch of a single female, but over a few generations, not that many, 2 or 3 or 4, it may grow to contain thousands of spiders. And we can actually watch this demographic process happening, and we can also observe colonies dispersing and colonies going extinct. So here's a cartoon based on my field notes from when I was, I think, a grad student, long time ago, where just for reference here, here's myself, just for reference to the size of the colony. And we see how over a few months, this colony disintegrated and disappeared without leaving any descendant colony. So this is something that happens. Colonies may go extinct, and the question is why they do that? Why does that happen? But they also give rise to dispersal events by which new colonies are produced. And this varies depending on the species. So here we have the species that we saw already before, the females with the egg sacs. This would be the web of maybe a single female or just 2 or 3 females. They lay their eggs, the offspring develop, they reproduce, they grow the colony. And in this species, I have seen colonies, and here's just hard to photograph these, but photograph from underneath the leaves where there are thousands of spiders. And I have seen colonies that have a size of 2 by 3 by 4 meters in volume. So it's very, very impressive. And this species is characterized by what I call explosive colony proliferation. So once they reach a relatively large size, individuals just disperse out, burst out of the colonies, and they establish these small propagules that contain 1 or a few females. So this is Theridion nigranulatum, a species that actually was fortunately to discover when I was doing my fieldwork in the rainforest in Ecuador. Another species that is really fascinating is this bright yellow spider, which I also was lucky to find. It's called Ebutina binotata because it has this sort of bright yellow color with these 2 dots on the back. And this species is very interesting. It makes a sheet of silk that covers the surfaces of leaves. And the spiders are typically sitting at the edges underneath the leaves. And the offspring typically are in the more protected areas of the web, and prey tends to get attached, trapped on the surface like on a trap paper. And the spiders sort of run from underneath to grab the prey that has got there. And they need to kind of cooperate with each other to move the prey down to the other side of the leaf. And it's really interesting to watch them doing this because the web is very sticky. So they have to sort of balance holding this prey up as they go around the edge. And there's 2 or 3 or 4 individuals helping each other do this. So that's a fascinating thing about this species. Another, and in general, social spiders transport their prey towards the more protected area of the webs. This species is also really interesting because its colonies reproduce by fission. So as the webs are expanding or the colonies are expanding in sort of this, on the leaves as they are growing in size, they sort of become separated with each other, and that results in fission of the colonies. But the most amazing thing about this particular species is that this life cycle of colony fissioning is accompanied by a nomadic phase. So just before they lay eggs, as during the time that they are mating, the spiders migrate from the location where they were born to a new location that may be hundreds of meters away from their original location. And they do so, you can actually watch them in the forest following each other single file in these sort of threads that they throw along the forest. And I've been able to follow, oh my goodness, we have some construction happening. I hope that's all right. So I have been able to follow them for dozens of meters in the forest and several hours. And I had a colony in a terrarium, a very large terrarium, that moved around for several weeks before it settled. And once they settled, they laid their eggs. So this is a species that reproduces by fission with a nomadic phase. And the last species I'm going to be describing is a lynx spider. If people who are familiar with spiders, they may know that lynx spiders typically do not build webs. But it turns out that there is a genus of lynx spiders that builds webs. And it is in this genus that the social species has originated. And the webs that this species builds are these sort of 3-dimensional dense structures that, as you're gonna see, is gonna be key to the story as to why the spiders are social. But because these guys are lynx spiders, they have very good vision. Typically, spiders don't see very well. They use the vibrations of the web to sort of orient themselves. But these ones descend from a lineage that has very good vision. So when you're approaching these webs, the spiders actually, you can see them looking at you and they run away from the person approaching to the other side of the web. And this species is also really interesting because it's an exception to the biased sex ratios. So in this species, the sex ratios are 1-to-1, and this species is outbred. And some genetic data suggests that males are migrating between the colonies. So as you can see, these spiders are phylogenetically very diverse. In fact, practically every social spider that we know of is an independent origin of sociality. So here is the tree of all spiders. And we can see the number of independent origins here along the branches. And even in the case where there is multiple species within the same genus, most of those are an independent origin. And despite this phylogenetic diversity, the spiders have a very similar social system. So with the one exception of the one species being outbred, the others are inbred. They all build some sort of communal nest in all but the one of species. These nests are these 3-dimensional dense structures. They cooperate in building and maintaining the web. They cooperate in prey capture. They share their food, and they have communal brood care. So here we have hugely magnified female in an African social spider in the genus Stegotyphus, and she is feeding these spiderlings by regurgitation, and these may or may not be her own offspring. So I'm going to stop just for a second. Is the noise outside really a problem, or should I try to go out there and see whether I can get them to stop? Or
it doesn't bother me too much.
No.
I can't even hear it. It's fine.
Okay.
Okay.
Don't worry about it.
All right. Okay. Okay. Well, let's go on then. So there are a number of questions that we can ask about social spiders based on what I have just presented to you. So why do they have the biased sex ratios? Why do they inbreed? What are the short and long-term consequences of this sort of strong inbred system? Why the colonies go extinct? When do they disperse? Why they have these unstable colony dynamics? And those are questions that I will not be able to address today. This is part of my earlier work, and I will not be talking about it today, but maybe one of these days I could give a talk about those things instead. And today what I'm going to be talking about is about why they are social and where they are social, and how does sociality change their ecological niche. So before I move on to that, I'd like to thank Dr. Chiti de Vries, who was a professor at the university where I did my undergraduate degree, who introduced me to social spiders back when I was an undergraduate. We had a field course during which one of the exercises was to watch a social spider nest. And one of the things that we had to do was actually count the number of males and females. And that's how I got interested in the first question that I worked on, is why they have the biased sex ratios. And Dr. de Vries has also been instrumental in helping, collaborating with me and helping with our work through the students that he has sponsored doing undergraduate thesis at the Catholic University in Quito. So this is the photos of some of them that have worked with me, and I will be talking about the work of some of them. And also my long-term field assistant and collaborator, Germán Esteves, who was also a student at the university in Ecuador. And of course, like the work of all of us, it's a team effort. There have been numerous students, both at the University of Arizona and the University of British Columbia, who have been involved in this work. And I will be referring to work of all the students that are shown in these photographs here. There are others that are not featured here because they would be part of the other talk. And so one of the earlier things that we did was to look at how fitness changes as a function of colony size. And we're lucky working with social spiders because we're actually able to create colonies of different sizes. So here we have my student Paul Tufino in Ecuador establishing a new colony. And so we can control the size of the colonies that we established, and we can look at how that size affects the fitness of individuals within colonies. We can look at overall fitness and also different components of fitness. So one of the things that we looked at here, and this is the species Anelosimos eximius, is that the probability of female reproduction actually decreases with colony size. They lay a single egg sac per female. And so in this case, just by counting the number of females and the number of egg sacs that have been laid in a colony, we can determine what proportion of females have laid. And we see that that proportion decreases with colony size. So that doesn't look very good in terms of why they are social. Their clutch size, however, increases with colony size. But the factor that really changes and has a positive, where colony size has a positive effect, is the proportion of the offspring that survive. We see here that there's very, very low survival in the very small colonies, and then it increases with colony size. And if we put these three components of fitness together, we see that the average fitness of females within the colonies is a maximum at some intermediate colony sizes. And I would argue that similar shapes of the fitness function apply to perhaps not all, but many of the social organisms that we work with. And I would argue that the shape of this function is what explains why they live in groups. But there are different ways that we can arrive to a function like this. So one possibility would be a species that could be doing just fine in a given environment, but there is an ecological opportunity to access some resource that would provide a benefit if they cooperate and live in groups. And an example of that could be, for instance, the tree-killing bark beetles. So bark beetles are doing just fine, colonizing dead trees, but there are all these live trees that could be a really rich resource if they could access them. And so by working together to attack these live trees, they are able to sort of access this ecological opportunity. Or another possibility is that it's a species that is trying to colonize an adverse environment where solitary individuals could not persist. So here we have the replacement line at fitness 1. And so it would be a species that would have negative growth in a given environment. But if they live in groups and cooperate, they could persist and not occupy that environment. And an example of that may be the naked mole rats that live in these extremely arid deserts in Africa, where there are these very short windows of time when they are able to dig to find the next batch of resources. And in order to succeed at this, they need to have dozens of individuals digging in different directions so that one of those has a chance of finding the next batch of resources. So I was interested in finding out which of these two cases applied to social spiders. And I actually originally thought maybe they are social because they are these big insects that solitary spiders cannot access, and therefore that's why they are social. So this brings me to the first two questions. Why do the associations form, and what factors explain the diverse systems? And usually it is a combination of environmental factors and organismal features that will determine where things are social and why. And I would argue that in the case of the spiders, what explains why they are social is these dense and, for the most species, three-dimensional webs. And these webs, so all the genera where social spiders have originated build some sort of dense web, and in most of the cases, three-dimensional structure. So we see here the nests of different species in different genera, very different shapes, but still this sort of irregular mesh with quite a bit of silk in it. So this type of web would be shareable, in contrast to an orb web that only a single individual can build and use. These webs are also presumably costlier to build and maintain than other webs that use less silk. They are also not just prey capture devices, but they offer also protection against predators. So it is a resource that individuals wouldn't want to leave because they are protected there. If they were to disperse, they would be exposing themselves to predation. And also they should be subject to scaling laws of 3D objects. And let me just focus right now on the question of costlier to build and maintain. So are they really? So we are kind of still working on this question, but with a student at UBC and a former postdoc, we've looked at the content in terms of silk in webs of different types. So our webs, these tangle webs and these sheet and tangle ones, and most of the social spiders are the sheet and tangle type. And we see here that the web content as a function of either the mass of the individuals or the mass of the colonies, because we have a social species here, increases, of course, with the size of the spider or the size of the colony, but there is orders of magnitude difference in the amount of silk contained in these sheet and tangle webs compared to the orb and the tangle webs. And here we have the social species that very nicely, sort of, it's a continuation of what the solitary species here would be doing in terms of web content. And if we look at the webs of these social species as a function of colony size, and now we look at the web content per unit spider mass, we see that, and also per capita, there is a decrease in the amount of silk that they need to produce if they are in a bigger colony. So this would be another reason why they live in groups. There is an economy of scale from group living. So those are, I would argue, these type of webs are the intrinsic factor that explains why they are social. What about the environmental factors? So an indication of what those might be comes from the geographic distribution of the social species. So we see here the species in different families. They are all located in the world tropics. And within the tropics, they are located at the lower elevation. So here we have a magnified picture of Ecuador, where we see the Andes going through. So this would be a high elevation area. And this is the distribution of the social and the subsocial species in the genus Avilés. And we see that the social species here in red are concentrated in the tropical areas and in the lowlands and absent from the higher latitudes and higher elevations. On the other hand, the subsocial species here in blue are absent from the lowland rainforest, and they are present at higher latitudes and higher elevations. So there are two patterns here that need to be explained. One is why the subsocial species are absent from the lowland rainforest, and why are the social species restricted to the lower elevation wet tropics. And for this, grad student Jennifer Guevara, currently is a postdoc at McMaster University, developed some niche models of spider sociality of the species in the genus Avilés. And she looked at all kinds of environmental factors, temperature, precipitation, variability in these various things, seasonality, and all kinds of things. And the two factors that were common to both elevation and latitude, and that had the greatest explanatory power, were temperature and precipitation. And so we see here how as temperature and precipitation increases, the probability of social spiders being there increases, and the probability that the subsocial ones will be there drops completely. So what does temperature and precipitation have to do with spider sociality? So I would argue that precipitation actually has a direct effect because of these dense and costly webs. We have, so I will show you in a minute how in the areas where the social spiders occur, it not only rains a lot, but it also rains very hard. So the rain can be concentrated in short periods of time where the strength of the rain would be such that it damages or destroys the webs. And the other thing that happens with temperature and precipitation is that productivity increases, metabolic rate increases, and we have also data to show that along with those, predation rate increases. So let me show you that data from master's student Catherine Hoffman and my current student Luis Camacho. And here we're looking at the rate at which it's raining. So it is how hard it rains, millimeters per hour as a function of elevation. And we see that it rains a lot harder at this elevation here, which corresponds to the lowland rainforest. And then the intensity of the rain decreases with elevation. And likewise, we see a decrease in the rate of predation. And there is actually a dramatic drop in the rate of predation. This is rate of predation per hour. And this was estimated with baits along transects on both sides of the Andes, looking at how much predation is happening every half an hour in 48 sites on both at different elevations. And so there is a dramatic drop in predation. And the idea is that in areas where precipitation is high and predation rate is high, you cannot really be there as a solitary or subsocial spider if you build these dense three-dimensional webs. So we call this the predation-precipitation hypothesis. So basically the idea is that increasing predation and precipitation intensity in interaction with these dense 3D webs makes it that solitary and subsocial species in general with these types of webs cannot be there. So they have to be in a group in order to survive in these, I would call harsh environments, given the type of webs that they build. So we've done some tests of these predation-precipitation hypotheses. Again, Catherine did a study where she transplanted. So at intermediate elevations, there is a mixture of social and subsocial spiders. And she took the subsocial species from this intermediate elevation and transplanted dozens of nests to the lowland rainforest, and then as controls nests in the native habitat. And the idea would be that those transplanted to the lowland rainforest would do a lot worse than those at the native habitat. And then to test the hypothesis that it is rain and predators that are responsible for this, we carried out some experiments where we protected some nests from predators, we protected some nests from the rain, with these sort of very high-tech devices, just tarps and some sort of plate that contained tanglefoot that would prevent crawling predators from getting up the nests. So we had 4 treatments protected from both predators and rain, others with no predators, others with no rain, and some untreated nests. And so what happened with those? So we're looking here at the results, the 4 treatments at the native higher elevation site and in the lowland rainforest. And the first thing we see here is that, yes, they do a lot better at the higher elevation than in the lowland rainforest. But the interesting thing is that there was no difference between the treatments at the higher elevation because based on this hypothesis, rain and predators are not a problem there. Whereas the unprotected nests, so the black line here, did significantly worse than those that were protected from either rain, predators, or both. So this provides evidence that both rain and predators are at least partly responsible for preventing this solitary and subsocial species, at least in this genus, from being in the rainforest. And of course, the key thing really is the web, because there are lots of solitary spiders there, but they build different kinds of webs. They don't build these dense webs. There's only a couple of exceptions that we are interested in trying to figure out how they deal with the problem of rain there. So this data basically suggests that solitary living in Anelosimos is unsustainable in the lowland rainforest. And I'm going to show you again data that we collected before in terms of the fitness of individuals to show you here that individuals that are in very small colonies or just solitary, which do happen in the social species, they are not able to replace themselves. So this is a study we looked at before, which we have repeated with another Anelosimos species where this effect is even more dramatic. So solitary living or living in very small groups for species in this genus is not sustainable in the rainforest. And that was actually kind of a surprise for me because originally, as I mentioned before, I was expecting that the reason why they were social is because being social, they could access these large insects in the rainforest. But it turns out that if they weren't in groups and cooperated, they just simply couldn't be there. So one of the answers as to why they are social is because if they weren't in those areas, they couldn't basically occupy those kinds of habitats where rain and predation are intense. So that was the one pattern. The other one is, why are the social species not found at the higher elevations and higher latitudes? To look at this, we go back to the environmental factors. So temperature, again, increases productivity and metabolic rate. And what we have found is that both of those together, and especially metabolic rate, may be responsible for a pattern of insect size, where we have found that insects in the warmer, lower elevation areas are bigger than the insects at the higher elevations and higher latitudes. But before we discovered this, our original, and I will show you that this is because of this 3-dimensional scaling of these webs. But before we discovered this insect size pattern, we originally thought, well, maybe there just isn't enough food at the higher elevations or higher latitudes to sustain large colonies. So we sample insects in the environment in places where social and subsocial spiders live. We looked at the prey that they are eating. And to our surprise, what we found is that there's actually plenty of insects at some of the higher elevations, plenty of insect biomass and insects at the areas where there are no social spiders. So this is the cloud forest area, about 2,000 meters elevation, high latitude area in Arizona. And again, the biomass in those areas was not significantly less than the total biomass that we found in the rainforest. So with that, we can reject the prey abundance hypothesis. And instead, what we found is that what differs is the size of the insects. The size of the insects in the lowland rainforest are considerably larger than the insects at the higher latitude or higher elevation. So here we're looking at a log scale. So this is a very significant size difference. And we have repeated this study, this time with grad student Jennifer Guevara. And we look here at the distribution of insect sizes, the higher elevation cloud forest area, the large insect size classes are missing from there, practically missing, whereas they are here in these very large insects are found in the lowland rainforest. And again, we have a log scale here. So we call this the prey size hypothesis. And the idea here is that with increasing insect size in interaction with these three-dimensional webs, that is what allows the social species to be present in certain areas. So why does insect size matter? And so here, this has to do with the scaling of three-dimensional objects. So as you know, as three-dimensional objects grow in size, the surface doesn't grow as fast as the volume. So if you were to plot surface area to volume ratio, it would be a declining function of the volume. And this matters because the insects that are intercepted by the colonies, they are intercepted as a function of the surface that is presented to the environment, but the energy needs of the colonies are a function of the volume, the spiders here occupying the volume. So one prediction from this three-dimensional scaling pattern is that the number of prey per capita should be a decreasing function of colony size. So we looked at this number of insects collected per capita, a species at a cloud forest area, 2,200 meters elevation, and a social species in the lowland rainforest. And we did find the pattern that had been predicted. The number of insects per capita decreases with colony size. And so that seems to be a bit of a surprise. Why would these spiders stay together if they are getting fewer insects per capita? But if it turns out that if they are in an area where there are large insects present, by cooperating in prey capture, they are able to capture bigger and bigger insects as colony size increases. And as a result of that, fewer but larger insects, biomass per capita is the hump function of colony size. So this would explain both why they are in groups, because they are getting more food in intermediate colony sizes, but it would also explain why eventually they disperse. If we go to the high elevation area, on the other hand, large insect size classes are missing. Spiders, even though they may try to capture bigger insects, they aren't there. And as a result of that, biomass per capita decreases with colony size. And this, again, we have a log scale here for colony size. This would explain why these spiders don't stay together for a new generation, but they disperse before they mature and have their own offspring. So why are they social? So they are social because in order to colonize this environment where solitary individuals cannot persist, but also they need in that environment the presence of these large insects in order to be there. Unfortunately, rain, predation, and large prey come together. They are correlated with each other. So that defines basically the lowland tropical rainforest. In terms of where they are social, so they are social in the areas where these conditions are extreme and where the solitary or subsocial species cannot occur. So just to sort of illustrate that, subsocial species, their incidence declines with the intensity of rain, predation, and insect size. Insect size is just a coincidence, I would say, and where social spiders can occur in those areas because insect size, large insects allow it. And I would sort of suggest that similar considerations with very different reasons should apply to other social systems. And I will, so it may be, and I think that what really matters is the shape of this fitness function. So it may be in some cases predation or a combination of factors. It may be the potential to capture resources that are too large or too difficult for single individuals to capture. It may be colonizing these harsh and predictable environments, or it may be outcompeting other members of your own species or other social groups or other species, or also your role as a predator or prey. And when you combine these different factors, at the end of the day, I would sort of suggest that what we get is a fitness function that explains why they are social in particular areas. So that would be the sort of 2/3 of my talk. I have one more section, which is what happens once they have evolved sociality in terms of their ecological niche. And for that, just a brief review of niche theory. The idea is that in a given area, species tend to be sufficiently different so that they are using a different set of resources and they can coexist. And people have typically looked at differences in body size of morphology as leading to this differential resource use. But what I like to sort of suggest today is that group size and level of sociality may also lead to differential resource use, and these may play a role in the assembly of ecological communities. And for this, we again take inspiration from the social spiders and see what they tell us. As we were doing the work looking at these elevation patterns of insect size and rain and predation and all of these things, we noticed that the communities of indigenous and elosimos contain species that were different from each other everywhere. So in places where you can only have social species, they tended to be different in body size. In places where you can have multiple social systems at this higher latitude area, they can be, they are not two species that have the same level of sociality. So we wanted to ask whether these differences are associated with differential resource use and whether within these communities, the species are more dissimilar than expected by chance. So to look at the differential resource use question, one of the places that we went to work at is Serra do Japi, Brazil, where there is a range of social systems represented in 5 different species. And for these, I'd like to thank my collaborators in Brazil, João Vasconcelos Neto and his students and postdocs who made our work in Serra do Japi possible. This is a fascinating place. It has the largest number of social spiders of any of the places I've worked at. And so in this place, you have indigenous and elosimos, 1 solitary species. You have a couple of subsocial species, but 1 is very rare. And then there is this intermediate social subsocial species where individuals some of the individuals that stay together, but they kind of keep their space within the web. And then a fully social species where everybody's sort of mixed in this communal nest. And so the question is whether these different levels of sociality are associated with differential resource use. And the short answer that I'm going to show you over the next few slides is that yes, they are in actually pretty impressive ways. So a grad student at the time, Jessica Purcell, she's currently a professor at UC Riverside, showed that the least social species with the small webs tend to be more common at the forest edge, whereas the social species with their bigger webs are more common in the forest interior. And we're looking here at a log scale, so quite a bit of a difference there. But also within each of these 2 habitats, they differ in how high from the ground their nests are placed. So the 3 species are occupying different heights from the ground, the 2 at the forest edge, the 2 in the forest interior. And if that wasn't enough, they're also occupying different positions in the plant from the core, the mid branch, or the tip. So they are spacing themselves out in space. They are also spacing themselves out in time. Even though this is a fairly seasonal environment, there is a winter, these species hibernate. However, in the time when reproduction happens, they are doing it out of sync with each other. So in the less social species, we see that the age class that predominates differs between these 2 different species here. And likewise, in the 2 more social ones, there is a 1 month offset in when the reproductive season happens. So they are spreading themselves out also in terms of their phenology and also in their use of resources, so the size of the prey that they capture. And this is actually pretty unbelievable data. It's kind of like a ladder. The least social species captures the smaller insects, the next one a little bit bigger, and then the most social one, even bigger one. And what's interesting is that these differences are not only due to differences in the size of the colonies, because these 2 species here, as you can see from the range here, have fairly similar colony sizes, but there is also a difference in how cooperative they are. So cooperation, in addition to group size, seems to play a role in this sort of resource partitioning. So we're looking here at the 2 more social species, and we're looking at the size of the insects as a function of colony size. And we see that one of the species is capturing bigger insects as the colonies get bigger, whereas the other one is not. And the same thing happens if you compare the ones with the smaller colonies. The one species individuals are not really capturing more insects in bigger colonies, but in the other species they are. And it turns out that this is due to differences in the level of cooperation. So these two species are more cooperative than the ones here below. And so we did this study looking at experimentally providing insects to these colonies of different sizes. And what we determined is that the least cooperative species, a lot of individuals, they are just basically standing back and letting other individuals capture prey. So they are not really involved in prey capture except for just a few individuals. Whereas most of individuals in the more cooperative species become involved in prey capture. So they are more cooperative. And this is what is responsible for the difference in the size of the insects that are captured between these two species that have a similar range of colony sizes. So to the question, are these differences associated with differential resource use? The answer is yes, as a function of level of sociality. But we also saw there are areas where there are the species have the same level of sociality as in this lowland rainforest area, but instead they differ in their body size, and these are pretty huge differences. These spiders here are about 2 millimeters in length. These are like about 3 or 4 millimeters in length, and these are like 5 or 6 millimeters in length. So we did a study looking at two of these species, the largest one and the intermediate size one, which can happen sympatrically in the same area. So we have a nest of each of these species here just a few meters away from each other. And we looked at the size of the prey that they are capturing. And so we're looking here at the total prey biomass. And we see that the smaller spider is capturing smaller insects, the bigger one, bigger insects. But the size of range of insects that the smaller spider captures is contained within the range of the larger spider. So this is a situation where there is an included niche. So that would sort of be a disadvantage for the smaller spider, but it turns out that the smaller spider is more efficient at capturing those small insects than the largest spider one is. So in that way, they are also spreading themselves out in sort of resource use. And the smaller spider is more efficient because it's faster to respond to the prey. They involve more instants in prey capture. And in a way, they are perhaps even more cooperative than the social one. The bigger one. So there is also differential resource use as a function of body size. And then the last question is, are these patterns that we observe differences in body size and level of sociality within communities more than expected by chance? So we see here that it seems that these things are really spreading themselves out, but is this a coincidence or not? And to address this question, we looked at communities across the Americas. And so this is just sort of what those communities look like in terms of level of sociality and body size for the spiders in the genus Anelosimos they contain. So we have data for 53 communities that contain from 2 to 5 species. We looked at a functional dispersion index, so how spread out they are in this 2-parameter space of body size and level of sociality. We calculated a dispersion index for the observed communities. And then we wanted to determine what would that look like if these communities were assembled randomly with respect to body size and level of sociality, but taking into account that some areas can only have social species, or others can have only subsocial solitary, and some can have both. So with that environmental filter as a control, we created these sort of randomly assembled communities, and this is the distribution of the functional dispersion index that we get that way. And the observed one is significantly different from expected. So are species within communities more dissimilar than expected by chance? And the data in this case suggests that yes, they are. So with this, I'd like to suggest that group living and cooperation may be factors in community assembly, and that this is likely to apply to other social systems. I was sort of struck by the fact that hyenas, there are different species of hyenas. They are different from each other, and my guess is that the ones that overlap are sufficiently different from each other. I think probably the same thing happens with mole rats. Similar thing happens with fish and lemurs. I remember that lemurs were also very interesting in wherever the different species were spread out in sort of house their social system. And I would suggest that these kind of considerations should also not only apply to social systems, but also to other levels of organization. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I'd like to thank my funding sources. And very especially, I'd like to thank the institutions in Ecuador that sponsored our work, the people in Ecuador that make this work, Ecuador and Brazil that made this work possible, the field stations, native lands, and the people in those areas that have helped maintain those areas in beautiful condition. And hopefully this will continue to happen for many generations to come. And this is just a picture of one of the places in the lowland rainforest where I have worked, the Cuyabeno Nature Reserve, another beautiful area in the cloud forest where the volcan Sumaco is found. And yeah, so thank you very much, everybody. And I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Leticia, for that fascinating talk. At this point, it's time for discussion. And what I'm going to remind folks is to please send a question to everyone within the chat function. And I'll call on you in the order that I get them. And again, if you're on YouTube, there are going to be people watching that for potential questions you may have. And so at this point, there came a question in direct to me initially, and that comes from Michael Dvorsky, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Leticia. That was very interesting. I think it is often not appreciated well enough that the relationship between prey and predators have a lot to do with sociality. And I would like to ask two questions, actually. I mean, the unsustainability of lowland forests for solitary spiders that you addressed in your second part of the talk, may that have to do also with the difficulty of overcoming large prey, as you showed that there is larger prey in lowland forests, and you showed that the social species Anelosimus dubiosus apparently cooperates in prey capture. Is that, apart from the fact that the nets may also be a limitation because of the precipitation patterns, may that also be important for sociality to be more rewarding in lowland forests?
So in terms of the size of the insects, the difference is the maximum size of the insects, but there are lots of little insects also. So the difference is just how large they get. So there are plenty of insects for solitary spiders in the rainforest. So I think that the size of the insects is not an issue. And indeed, most spiders in the rainforest are solitary. And so I actually kind of missed the second part.
Yeah, no, I didn't really ask the second part. The second part would be that, of course, spiders are not top predators. So they are not only predators, but they are also prey. Mm-hmm. So do spiders perhaps also benefit from being social? I mean, is there any kind of advantage like safety in numbers or whatever strategies they may have in a social group to avoid being predated?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, so they are, it seems so maintaining the web seems to be a major thing, but also defense from predators seems to be the other component that they get a benefit from being in a group. Because when you have multiple individuals, and this is one of the hypotheses of Susan Riker and collaborators, if the mother dies and the offspring haven't completed development, they may not be able to sustain themselves, especially with these sort of costly webs. So if multiple females are together, the mother dies, but somebody else remains behind to look after the offspring. So that may be part of the reason why in areas where predation is high, it also pays off to be in groups, because they can, by having communal root care, they can look after each other's offspring even after the mother may have been predated on. So definitely, predation is, interestingly enough, for a predator is a problem too. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, excuse me. Our next question comes from Sari Van Bell.
Hi, you just answered quite a bit of my question just to Michael Traboski. So, but given that temperature and heavy intensity of rainfall are factors that play a role in sociality in spiders, I'm stuck thinking, why aren't there more spider species social? Because obviously it's still raining very intensely for the for the solitary spider species in these same areas. So there must be something else that makes them beneficial to be social, but you kind of already answered.
Yeah, no, that is actually an excellent question. So I think one of the things is that the nature of the web, I think that the ones that build the orb webs are limited in terms of how much they cooperate, because that web needs to be built by a single individual and used by a single individual. So that basically excludes all the species that make these orb webs. So that there are still lots of spiders that build these irregular webs that are, so why hasn't sociality evolved more? And one possibility, and this is what is suggested by that distribution of, on this spider phylogeny of almost every single species is an independent origin. It may be that they may have a reason, but because for various reasons, they have evolved this inbred social system. This inbred social system actually makes them an evolutionary dead end. And we have actually proposed this in a paper, that this sort of strong inbreeding eventually causes these species to go extinct. So maybe we don't see that many because they have come and gone over time. So that's another possibility. I guess those are the two things that I can think about. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, our next question comes from Facundo Fernandez Duque.
Hi, really wonderful talk. Thank you for telling us about your research. I also kind of have a question about the predator-prey relationship. Given that insect size can be affected by the respiratory system, do you know if the predator size at those higher elevations might be affected by the oxygen levels?
Yeah, so that is one of the hypotheses as to why the insects may be smaller. Mm-hmm. I'm not a physiologist. I have not really looked into that. The explanation that has sort of caught my imagination is an explanation having to do with, it's Makarieva, it's a scientist in Russia, who suggests that if there is a minimum metabolic rate that is consistent with life, and that minimum happens at a bigger size if you're in a warm environment, that would explain why insects can reach bigger sizes in warmer areas, and they are smaller at the higher elevations or also higher latitudes. But oxygen may also contribute to that. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, but that is an interesting question for more physiologically oriented people to address, but I'm quite interested on that pattern and why it happens. And we're right now looking whether the spiders, we would predict the spiders also get smaller. But this, I have to say, this is looking across taxonomy, because often one can look within a single species and the opposite pattern may happen. But looking across the whole insect fauna or the whole spider fauna, that's where you see this pattern.
Okay, and thanks again for a really wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Okay, so next question comes from Tim Clutton-Brock.
Fantastically interesting animals. Can you tell us a little more about the distribution of inbreeding and outbreeding? And are there any of the species that live in really large colonies which are outbred?
Yeah, so all the 19 species that have that social system, it seems we don't have the genetic data for all of them, but we do have the sex ratio for all of them. So we can say that 18 of the 19 are inbred, even the ones that live in these really huge colonies. The only one that is not inbred is the one that lynx spider. And my guess is that because that spider descends from a lineage where they move very quickly, they are not limited in their dispersal ability, so that males are able in that species to move between colonies and find mates that way. But I think that the other spiders, even though they do have ways of dispersing, but the colonies tend to be fewer and far between. So it's kind of like the population collapses into these nests and leaves all these spaces, open spaces in between. And given the types of webs that they make, they cannot kind of move around and build their web and keep going further in the hopes of finding the next batch of colonies. So the benefits of being together and the costs of dispersing keeps them from dispersing, and it is what has led them to be inbred. And I would suggest, is that it's partly because as spiders, their dispersal abilities are not as impressive as insects, for instance. Although people would argue they balloon and they can move around on their threads, but it's still limited. And also the fact that they build these dense, costly webs that makes them beneficial to stay and save that resource rather than try to build it in a different place again.
And among the outbred species, is there any evidence of sex differences in dispersal?
Okay, so the subsocial ones, on the other hand, they where they disperse before they mate. Yes, I have studied a couple of times the dispersal patterns in those spiders, and half the males kind of disappear from my study site. And I think part of the problem is I just don't find them, they've gone somewhere else. So I think that it seems that the males are going further away than the females. In the one species that I've looked at in more detail is the species in Arizona. The males disperse earlier than the females, and they mature also earlier than the females. So it may also be a mechanism for inbreeding avoidance. So it does seem that those spiders are avoiding inbreeding the outbred ones, the subsocial ones.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Maren Hook.
Hello, thank you very much for the talk. A couple of years ago, there was an article, I don't quite remember, I think Novak, about group selection, I think in 2010 or 2011 or something like that. And that obviously got quite a huge response from people that were quite critical about the concept of group selection, at least as a general explanation. Do you think that there's any evidence that something like group selection is going on with the different teams or whatever of your spider populations?
Yeah, that was actually my PhD work. I suggested that what explains the biased sex ratios is group selection. When Maynard Smith and other people describe what wood selection would look like, they basically describe the social spiders. They said there would be many groups, they would be isolated from each other, they would be there on reproduction of groups, and that's exactly what the spiders are doing. So yeah, I think that these spiders actually are the poster child of group selection, and that group selection is not necessarily what explains their social behavior, but I think it for surely contributes to it. But I think that the biased sex ratios is evidence that group level selection is happening here. Because within and I do have some work that I have done in this was actually my PhD thesis, with some computer simulations showing how within colonies, the sex ratio should continue to try to go back to the Fisherian predicted 1-to-1 sex ratio. But colonies that produce more females grow faster, they have better survival, they reproduce more frequently, produce more daughter colonies. And because they are isolated from each other, their sex ratios there is heritability of the sex ratios through the generations. And that would explain why biosex ratios would be favored by differential survival and proliferation of colonies, even though there may be some countering of that within colonies. But also inbreeding would reduce the amount of genetic variability within the colonies, so that there would be very little selection for the one-to-one sex ratio within colonies, because there is almost no genetic variability there. But yeah, I think that these guys are what Maynard Smith was describing when he talked about the haystack model and things like that.
So please keep sending your questions in, particularly those on YouTube. We have someone tracking you, so if you have questions, please make sure throw them in the chat there, and someone will send them my way. Our next question comes from Carsten Schraden.
Yes, thank you, Leticia, for this fantastic talk. It's so fascinating to see such, for me, exotic animals, and we can still explain them with the same theories in ecology and evolution like everything else. And I think that's one of the big things in behavioral ecology. I have one very short question where we can probably give a very short answer, and then another question that is more showing my incompetence in social spiders. You mentioned now many times this high inbreeding in these social spiders, that they're nearly clones. I suppose there's not one single species of spiders where pathogenesis is described, but this is possible to evolve in spiders. Are there any examples of pathogenetic species?
Yeah, people have looked for that a lot. I seem to remember maybe an obscure paper here or there where they may have found something that looks like parthenogenesis, but it's definitely not a common thing. And given how inbred these things are, one would wonder. I mean, it would make more sense in a way just to dispense with males altogether, but they may be constrained. They have, there may be some sort of constraint that prevents that from happening.
Yeah, so that's exactly what the feeling I had, that probably they can't easily evolve it. Mm-hmm. My second question is regarding, you explained it in your talk, but I still, because I'm not so used to the terminology, I struggle that you talk once about subsocial versus social spiders. If you can explain this again, and then you had more or less cooperative species. Is this exactly the same? And then in the third kind of studies, you had level of society 1, 2, and 3. I assume this is solitary, subsocial, and social, or are these three different things? And then my final question with regard to this, do you see any flexibility within species that they can be something from, in the same species, you can find solitary, subsocial, and social communities?
Yeah, okay. All right, so, okay, let me start. It does get a little complicated because it is a little bit of a gradation between being solitary and fully social. In the solitary, and so it's a little bit arbitrary to define where one thing stops and the next one starts. So I would suggest that solitary species are the ones where, in spiders, the offspring are laid within an egg sac, and when they first eclose from the egg sac, they're always together. But then some of those disperse within days of eclosing from the egg sac. Those may take a week or two, and so those I would define as solitary with a very brief social phase. The ones that we call subsocial, they stay together to molt within the natal nest for a few instars. And so they overlap with the mother for a while. In some cases, the mother may die and the offspring are still together. And during this time, they are helping each other maintain the web, capturing prey together, sharing their food. But then they disperse before they become adults, or sometimes they even may become adults, but disperse before they mate and produce new offspring. So we refer to those as subsocial. And the social ones are the ones where they stay together as adults and mate with each other to produce a next generation. And the difference in terms of their behavior is that they have communal brood care, the social ones, because now you have multiple females reproducing within the colonies and they are looking after each other's offspring. But because at least in the genus Anelosimus, it's not as, it is the genus spider genus that has the most social spiders. So here you do have like a range because there are some species that are intermediate between social and subsocial. So a fraction of the females stay together. And so they maintain a relatively large colony, but within that colony, they are kind of spaced out. And their offspring, they kind of tend to surround the mother. And so those are the ones that are kind of less cooperative. So they may have a big web, but they kind of keep small territories within that web. Whereas in the more fully social ones, the more cooperative ones, everybody's like the offspring mixes together from everybody within the nest and everybody's looked after each other from everybody else in the colony. And we do see also a difference in the tendency to sort of cooperate in prey capture, which is what I showed in one of those studies. These ones where they tend to be spaced out, they also tend to only capture the smaller insects that come near where they are instead of sort of jumping on this bigger prey. And yeah, what determines that? It seems to be in that place in Brazil that's what allows them to use different prey size niches. And it seems kind of unbelievable to think that to that level, interspecies competition presumably would be responsible for differences in level of cooperation between these spiders. But the density of nests of these species, it's fairly high in this area of Brazil. So I mean, at least the pattern is there. Yeah, demonstrating competition between species in spiders is a little complicated, but yeah. So, and in terms of the level of sociality, because there is this gradation, I came up with an index. That was one of the papers that I suggested that we read, that it had different components to the index along this scale from when they disperse. So the ones that disperse very early get a 0, the ones that disperse a little later get a 0.5 or something like that. If they stay together past maturity, they get a bigger number. And I think in that index, it's only like the demography, how early they disperse, whether they are together as adults, more so than the behavior itself in terms of cooperation. Because, so I was trying to sort of define an index that is something that would be relatively easy to measure. And I suggested that I use mole rats as an example where an index like that could also be applied. And a third component to the index, I think one was whether they stay together as adults or not, when they disperse, and whether they have reproductive skew. But one could sort of, in species that don't have reproductive skew, one could drop that part of the index. And in the social spiders, there seems to be competition, perhaps a little bit of reproductive skew in some of the species. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers. But there is the species in Africa. There are 3 species in the genus Stegodipus, where there's only 3 species, and they are more sort of solitary, subsocial, and social. There is no disgradation.
Thank you.
Okay, so our next question is from Zulema Tan Martinez.
Yeah. Wonderful talk, Leticia. I have, I guess, a couple of questions. My understanding is that in most of the social spiders, there is no recognition of group members, so that virtually any other spider could come into the group and it wouldn't be attacked. And I wonder if that's true for all the social spiders or if it's only for some of them. And then the other question is somewhat related. In those artificial situations where you suddenly, because of a storm, something unusual has happened, you get this humongously big webs that cover entire trees or more than one tree. And I'm thinking of, I know something like that happened in Texas some years ago, and I think maybe it was India. And there, as I understand it, you get, it's like many different species, including at times species that are normally solitary. I wonder if you think those weird phenomena provide any insights to the normally social spiders.
Okay, so in terms of recognition, the very social species, they seem to not discriminate against, at least not in an obvious way, against spiders from other colonies. So that's when we have created artificial colonies, sometimes we just mix and match from different colonies to create a pool. You can also drop spiders from another web into a foreign nest and they are not attacked. However, this is not the case in the subsocial ones. Also, there is some species in Australia where we define them as subsocial, but there's one or two species that have biased sex ratio in that case because in there they mate before they disperse. In that species, as they are maturing, the spiders are beginning to disperse out of the nest, and the nests are not too far from each other, so that there is the possibility that a foreign individual may wander into another nest and then may be taking advantage of that, the food that that nest is capturing, that web the colony is capturing. In that species, Theo Evans has demonstrated that there is individual recognition. There seems to also be individual recognition in some of the subsocial species in the genus Ethology, and I think also in some of the social Analosymos studied in Uruguay by Carmen Vieira. I think that, so it seems that in the social ones, because the risk of a foreign individual coming into your web are practically zero, they don't seem to have developed or they have lost a colony recognition mechanism. But in the ones where dispersal is happening and foreign individuals can get into the webs, they seem to have some colony recognition mechanism. Yeah. In terms of those phenomena in Texas, it has also happened, I think, in Canada here. It may be that there is some kind of bloom of insect and abundance of food that allows the spiders to reproduce. And they would, yeah, I think that they can produce insights into the evolution of sociality and the ecology of sociality. I would guess so the three-dimensional nature of the webs is important. So even if there are lots of little insects, that doesn't solve the problem of fewer insects per capita. So if the insects are little, but the group is bigger, then you're still not getting enough food unless you're being able to capture these big insects. So I would be curious what happens in those situations where there are these big webs. I've seen photographs of that. I would actually love to go and look to see what's going on there. My prediction is that there would still be a limit because of the surface area to volume ratio situation there, because insects in and the high latitudes don't get to be as large as the ones in the tropics. But that would be a good test, actually. Maybe I'm wrong. Yeah.
Okay, our next question comes from Peter Kapler.
Yes, thanks for a very instructive talk. I have a question about the social spiders. Given the level of inbreeding that you alluded to and also the biased sex ratios, I was wondering what you know about individual reproductive strategies or the mating system of these species.
Yeah, so within colonies, it's hard to keep track of individuals because they are practically identical. So even using genetic techniques, it does seem though that within colonies, there's no reason to think that mating would not be panmictic because they move around within the nest. They have, one interesting thing though, is that even though there are so many females and so few males, males are still courting the females. Males are still attractive. So they are more brightly colored than the females. They do all kinds of displays. I have not really specifically studied the mating patterns, but I suspect that they may also be rejected as mates. So something is still maintaining some female toys, or I don't know what it is. So yeah, males are brightly colored. They display, they have to work hard to get females to mate with them. But in terms of the genetics, the sex ratio is chromosomally determined. The males produce 2 types of sperm. And the sex ratio seems to be already biased. So the sperm either with the 2 X chromosomes or no sex chromosomes. And that should, by meiosis, produce a 50-50 ratio. We already see a sex ratio bias in the embryos. So something happens between sperm production and the biased sex ratios. And there is a recent study that came out from the laboratory of Trine Bilde in University of Aarhus, where they showed that already in the sperm, the sex ratio is biased. They used cell sorting method to look at the sex ratio of individual sperm, and they showed that the sperm already has a sex ratio bias. So there may be something happening in male meiosis that may already bias the sex ratio, or maybe differential survival of sperm of the 2 types. And the mechanism for the sex ratio bias may differ in different species. So there is only one of the species that has been looked at, or the species in the genus Stegotyphus that have been looked at from this perspective, and maybe Anelosimus does it differently and still achieves the same thing. So we don't really know that yet. I don't know if that covers your question, or did you?
Yeah, I was more interested in the consequences of the biased sex ratios, but it sounds like there's something really interesting happening there in terms of sex roles that hasn't apparently been studied in much detail.
Also, yes, definitely there are things to do there. The males don't do much work. They don't do much work even when they are 1-to-1 sex ratio, I think, but even less here because there are so few of them there. They also die earlier, typically. So after they inseminate the females, they're no longer around because they are not involved in brood care. So yeah, but there are definitely things happening, and it would be interesting to study both how the tendency to help varies with the sex ratio in different species, and also the intensity of competition for mates, if that's going on or not. And yeah, things to do.
Great, thank you.
There are no questions in the queue right now, so if you have additional questions, please throw a question mark into the chat and I'll relay it to Leticia. Sorry, Van Belt has a question.
Well, continuing about these males, when you were talking about how new nests are built, you generally talked about females doing that, but where does the males come from? Are they also natal mates, or do they come from somewhere else?
Yeah, in the social species, they are natal males. So say that there is a new colony that has been established by a single female. She lays her egg sac, offspring are close, there's going to be sons and daughters there, and they just stay together and mate with each other. If there is a couple of females, they mix within that colony and they mate with each other. That is in the social species. In the subsocial ones, sons and daughters will be produced, but then both sons and daughters will disperse and mate with females from elsewhere and males from elsewhere. So in the subsocial...
Excuse me for interrupting you. They disperse when they're already fertilized.
Yeah, so in the social species, when dispersal happens and new colonies are established, the females have already been inseminated. Yes, okay. So there is a timing to this whole thing. And I think part of the reason why some colonies go extinct without dispersing is because there is a mistiming. And it's my hypothesis, and we have some data, but this is something that still needs more work. As the offspring are developing, they may have produced too many offspring. Maybe the resources didn't come as expected. So the offspring generation may not mature fast enough to be self-sufficient and maintain the web so that they mature and mate. And so in that case, the colony just fails. But if their timing has been right, the females mature, males and females mate, and then the inseminated females disperse, and then the males does. Sometimes they may join a new nest, but for the most part, by that time, they are already, many males have already died, and they will be dying soon thereafter. So it is inseminated females that disperse. Yeah.
So what is the life length? Are we talking here about a couple of weeks, or is it longer?
This in the ones in the rainforest, there may be, depending on the species, there's very small one has like 3 or 4 generations a year. The bigger one has 2.5 generations a year. It's a seasonal environment there. So, and then different colonies are in different stages of the life cycle. The ones in the temperate zones, like say the ones in Brazil, they have an annual cycle. In winter, they kind of go dormant. I'm forgetting this happens. I think this happens when the offspring are, I forget whether they go dormant before or after they have produced offspring. Yeah, I don't know if there is anybody here from from Argentina or Uruguay or no, Brazil actually, who would help me with that. I actually had that graph there. Anyways, but yeah, so the ones in the temperate zone have a year cycle. There are also species in India that have the monsoon season there. And I think the monsoons also create some sort of seasonality, and they seem to kind of slow down during the monsoon season. Likewise in Africa, the Stigotyphus ones, they go dormant in the hottest season, I think. And I think those also have a 1-year cycle. So it's between a year or a few months each generation. Yeah, so not weeks, that would be nice. So we could kind of keep it in the lab going for several generations. They're very hard to maintain in the lab, at least the ones in the neotropical ones that I work with. Yeah, so
and if I can take the liberty of asking another question, given that heavy rain is associated with sociality because the webs are costly, how much we are talking about heavy rain doing quite a bit of damage to these nests, right?
Yes.
And so it's a constant maintaining of these nests.
Exactly. I mean, after a heavy rain, you can go back and a colony has huge holes in it. The web is useless. They need to practically rebuild it so that they can capture prey again. Yes. Okay. But interestingly though, this rain factor doesn't apply to all the species and all the genera. The species in Africa, for instance, it doesn't rain there. And I think that the most important factor there is predation. There is documentation of ants raiding the spider webs, and the spiders defending themselves from ants, and the ones in bigger colonies being better able to withstand these attacks by ants. So I would suggest that it's rain and predation. In the rainforest, you have both, but in some places, there's some big disturbance that is going to cause big mortality, like some ant raids or things like that are going to be factors that may play a role in sort of selecting for group living.
Okay, thank you.
There are species, sorry, I should say also, there are species in the rainforest in Gabon, though, where it also rains, like Agelena consociata and Agelena republicana. There are a couple of species there where rain is also a factor. But the ones that I'm referring to are those that happen in sort of more scrub savanna habitat in these other genus where rain is not part of it.
Okay, well, we will be thinking about the spiders when it's raining. Thank you.
So our next question is from Zulema.
Yeah. Leticia, I wonder if you have any thoughts about the huntsman spiders, the ones that are studied by Linda Rayer, because those seem to be totally different from the regular social spiders. And I was just wondering if you've given any thought or what we know at this point about the huntsman spiders.
Yes, yes, yes. Originally, I had classified those as social. I've never seen them personally, but I had people who worked on the huntsman visit my lab, and we actually published an early paper on those. But they are very different. They indeed are very different. They don't build webs, for one thing. So people who are not familiar with them, these are hunting spiders. They make colonies under the bark of trees. And it seems that the main factor for why they live in these groups is the limitation of these places where they can build their homes. And they are not inbred. They are not multi-generational. These colonies are more, so now they are classified as subsocial. But subsocial with the mother laying multiple clutches of offspring, so that these colonies can grow to contain hundreds of individuals, but it's the offspring of a single mother, or maybe the mother replaced, some other spider replaced the original occupant of the web, and then it's multiple, but then they really don't like each other. So these guys do have recognition across colonies, and they fight with each other if they are from a foreign colony. And again, in this case, I would say, it is because these guys move around to hunt for food. They do have a little bit of, after they capture food, I think that they capture food individually, or they may help maybe two individuals capturing food, but there is a little bit of sharing, but it's very limited. And so, yeah, it's mostly family units, but with multiple generations of offspring within the nest, but they may contain, a couple hundred individuals.
Yeah.
And they are, pretty neat.
Yeah, I did get to see them personally because I visited Linda's lab, and they're amazing. They're huge, for one thing. You know, you're used to social spiders being generally really tiny. These things are enormous, and it was incredible. I mean, she had a large aquarium, and there must have been like, I don't know, 50 spiders in there, and they're crawling over each other, and it was just really dramatic and impressive.
Yeah, actually, I have to correct myself on that. I have seen them in the lab, in Linda Rayer's lab, but I've never seen them in the field. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay. Yeah.
And also, they were the ones that were used in arachnophobia, I think.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
So we have another question. This is from Lindalani Makue.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Leticia, for such a wonderful talk. It's quite scary to think of spiders as being so social, maybe, as you mentioned, because of movies such as arachnophobia. But so my question is more related to what you mentioned about the impact of the environment on the sociality of the spiders. For example, with the rains damaging the nests of the spiders. Have you seen examples maybe where, with the especially with the changing climate, where the spiders now change their social behavior to try and minimize the costs to this?
Yeah. So, okay, besides climate change, I will try to sort of address that in a little bit. But the other issue with these spiders is habitat degradation and fragmentation. Because they have a meta-population structure, you need to have populations of colonies in order for these things to do well. And there are some species that are understory specialists in the rainforest, and they have disappeared from very fragmented areas because if there aren't sufficient colonies to maintain the meta population going with this extinction and recolonization, they don't do well. So habitat fragmentation is a problem. And I don't think that they could adapt to that. I think that reversing, I mean, the way to adapt to that would be reversing sociality. Perhaps they could change to, yeah, well, I don't know if that would be possible, to dispersing sooner, but my guess is that dispersal depends on food. In terms of climate change, the rainforest is going to get drier. I guess they are going to like that, some of them, the spiders, less rain. But I don't know how that is going to change predation and how that's going to change insect size. I actually not quite clear. I think I sort of have an idea of how temperature will affect insect size. I'm not quite clear on how precipitation will affect insect size. We have a study done on the coast of Ecuador where it goes from very dry to very wet at more or less the same elevation and therefore more or less the same temperature. And it does seem that insects in the wetter area, perhaps because of greater productivity, are a bit bigger, but the difference is not as dramatic as with the elevational temperature gradient. So if it gets drier, some species that do okay at the forest edge may be okay for a while. The ones that are understory specialists, they are not gonna make it. And so that's gonna basically take care of the bright yellow spider, that's kind of a specialist of river edges, but in the interior, that's gonna take care of Theridion with the white X-axis. Those guys are not gonna be there. Tapinilus is kind of forest edge, and Anelosimus eximius is kind of forest edge. As long as there is enough food and trees, and sufficient habitat, continuous habitat for the meta population to keep going, they may last a bit longer, but it's a concern. Yeah. Yep, as all of our study systems. For instance, in these forest edge specialists, I used to find dozens of nests along this road in Ecuador. That used to be a narrow road. They widen it, and then for some reason they are pruning the trees periodically. I guess so they cannot keep up the meta populations with this constant destruction of the web. So you hardly find any of these spiders anymore.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Leticia.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a question from Adriana Maldonado-Chaparro.
Hi, Leticia. Thank you for such a nice talk. I learned a lot about spiders today. My question is kind of like, I want to hear your thoughts about how do you think environmental unpredictability is related to sociality within the tropical system? So I'm thinking in the rainforest, we would expect higher unpredictability of the environment, not only because of perhaps variation in the amount of rainfall throughout the year, but also, you know, trees fall, branches fall off as well. And that, I would assume, creates a higher unpredictability for such a tiny organism. So that's my question.
Yes. Yeah. Uh-huh. So, so local disturbance is likely to be a big factor. And I think that may actually be a factor in the extinction of colonies, because they may, in a sense, bet in terms of upstream production based on their past experience, how much food has been arriving at a particular area. But if it rains solid for a week, there are no insects. So they may be in trouble that way, not getting enough food. And yeah, you're right, also falling branches could be a factor in colonies getting damaged. There is a slight seasonality in the rainforest also. There is the drier months and the wetter months. My impression is that at least the more forest edge specialists do better when it's a little drier. So the experiment where we created the artificial colonies, we had done so in the rainy season and our experiment failed. They didn't do well. We had to repeat it in the drier season where the colonies take hold better because they are not damaged by the rain as frequently. So I think that the unpredictability may not be an explanation for, that's a good question, because actually we are developing a model. I don't know if Shock is here. I'm collaborating with some researchers in Hungary right now, developing a model. And one of the factors that we're looking at is disturbance. And how it changes along the elevational gradient. But here I count as disturbance, predation, and rain, because that would sort of have a sudden effect in reducing the population size. And where there is higher disturbance, it pays off to be together in a group, because you can sort of recover better from these disturbances. And we do have data on that, that larger colonies, when they are affected by a very strong rain, or maybe there's been an ant raid or something like that, they recover better than the smaller ones. So yeah, I think that disturbance may actually help maintain their social systems, even though, let's say that. And in terms of rain, the higher elevations, the rain is constant and soft. So it's not an issue in terms of the maintenance of the webs up there.
Thank you.
So we don't have any more questions in the queue. If you have a question, please feel free to throw a question mark in there, and I will present it to Leticia. And in the meantime, Leticia, I had a question, and again, I beg ignorance, much like Carsten does. Is there some level of partitioning of the cooperative behavior that you're seeing? And I asked that question because I'm curious about sort of the risk of different behaviors. Like, I can imagine maintaining the web is expensive and also risky.
Yes, there is a difference, and there are differences also in the different genera. So the two genera for which this has been studied a bit are the genus Untitled that has the 7 species, and the genus Stegodiphyus or Stegodiphyus that has 3 social species. And there seems to be a difference between those two. In Untitled, there are an age class difference in terms of what they do. So the younger ones don't participate in prey capture or web repair when they're very small, but then as they grow a bit bigger, then they start to participate in web repair. And the last thing that they do once they are subadults or adults is prey capture. So there is that level of differentiation. It has been looked to see whether there may be differences among individuals of the same age class. And it does seem that there may be some competition that may kind of produce a positive feedback loop that makes it that some individuals may be a little stronger, a little bigger, and then they get a little more food. And because they are competing in the bigger colonies to reproduce, they may be the ones that end up reproducing. But I would sort of think of that more as a natural type of competition thing going. But in the genus Stegodiphyus, there seems to be some differences in the tendencies of individuals of the same age class, with some being more likely to do web repair or maintenance and others being more likely to reproduce. Yeah, I'm kind of forgetting the details of that, but yeah, so there is people from the University of Aarhus that did this study comparing the two different genera.
And is there some level of inheritance at the web?
Yes, so yeah, they tend to stay in the same place and just expand the same web. Actually, that is really, it's kind of pretty fascinating to see, as you may have a web that is about this size. And as the spiders get bigger, they need a bigger web. And it's kind of molting in a way. They kind of build an outer shell that you can see very clear webbing, and you see the older nest inside. And they can just continue to span the colony like that, unless something, you know, that particular location has gone really bad. There's a branch that has fallen there. It's been really damaged, in which case they may abandon the old nest site, but they would just move a few centimeters, a meter or two, to a nearby branch. So they don't go very far, except when they are dispersing. And when they are dispersing, when they disperse, so there is variability within species in terms of the mode of dispersal. So the Untitled ones, the one that has these really huge webs, sometimes they produce small propagules with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 females. Other times it is kind of a budding thing. Part of the colony moves over and establishes a new web. So when dispersal happens, if it's a large group of individuals, they just move a meter or two or a few centimeters away. But when they are dispersing as solitary individuals, they can go further away, dozens of meters away from the nest. And I think that one of the reasons why that bright yellow spider has a nomadic phase is because it may be a mechanism to prevent competition among the daughter colonies. So they have spread out, produced two separate nests, and then one or both of them move away from each other so that they are not in competition if they happen to encounter each other again. So they just kind of move away to somewhere else.
Very cool, thank you. I'll give folks just another second or two to ask a last question. We do have one from Tim Glenbrock.
Why do you think spiders haven't gone down the reproductive suppression and infertility angle?
That's a very good question. Oh my God. I thought I had an answer a little while ago and I'm forgetting what it was. One thing may be that they are constrained in terms of how many offspring, in terms of producing offspring repeatedly, but I may be wrong on that. And so they may not be able to increase reproductive rate to the level that a single female could replace many females reproducing at the same time. Another thing could be because they are highly inbred, they are already practically identical within colonies. So it wouldn't sort of make selection between the colonies any stronger if they had a single reproductive. There was something else with nutrition and I'm forgetting what it is. Yeah, no, that is a question that I have been wondering about and I don't have a straightforward answer to it. It's a good question. It's interesting. Yeah.
Many thanks. I mean, I think it's a serious puzzle, and isn't it? But
the other thing is that
quite broad.
By biasing the sex ratio, they kind of compensate because that increases the rate of reproduction by producing more females. So I guess they kind of went an alternative route, but then the naked mole rats are inbred and use social. I think that in the case of the naked mole rats, they are very limited in how fast they can expand, and being used social would allow them to be. It's kind of the ultimate female bias sex ratio, I guess, being used social. I don't know. Yeah, so it's a good question, and I really don't have a very coherent answer, at least right now. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think that's certainly a nice segue into next week. We'll be hearing about eusociality in ants from Romain Liebrich. Be a nice continuation of this discussion. There's any other questions out there, please feel to toss them in. If not, we're coming up close on the hour, so I bet you Leticia might appreciate a break before she meets with some of the core member individuals. So I guess with that, thank you, Leticia. That was I really enjoyed that talk. It was really cool, and the discussion was wonderful. And thanks to everyone for asking questions and being engaged. I hope to see everyone next week. And people want to stick around for a few minutes to chat, please feel